5-year-old shouldn't know how to ask that question. But Ellie Beckett did. "Mommy, why does Daddy have our house?" Not when are we going back. Not can we go home. Why does Daddy have our house? The kind of sentence that tells you a child has already done the math. That ownership has shifted. That the place where her drawings were taped to the refrigerator, where her bed had a purple blanket with stars on it, now belonged to someone else. She was 5, and she already understood that. Nora Beckett didn't answer. She reached between the front seats and adjusted the jacket draped over both girls like a blanket, tucking the collar beneath Ellie's chin, pulling the sleeve across Cora's shoulder. A ritual. The kind of careful, quiet gesture that mothers repeat when they have nothing else left to give. And then she opened her mouth, and Cora spoke first from behind her, quiet and flat, the way she said everything now. Because the police said so. Outside, 40 feet away, a black Range Rover had been idling at the gas pump, 3 minutes longer than any fill-up requires. The fluorescent lights above the pumps buzzed and flickered. The air smelled like old diesel and cold concrete. Nora had chosen this station because the bathroom didn't require a purchase, and because the far corner of the lot was dark enough that no one noticed a car that didn't move. Inside the Range Rover, a man in a dark wool coat was not looking at the gas gauge. He was looking at the condensation on the sedan's windows, the kind that builds when people have been breathing inside a car for hours. At the small handprint pressed against the glass, already fading, Dominic Sava stepped out. He didn't walk toward the car. He stood beside the pump and watched. Sullivan, behind the wheel, began to speak, and Dominic raised one finger without turning around. Silence, because the wind had just carried a sentence across the lot. Cora's voice, 8 years old, steady as a soldier. "Mom, don't cry. I'll stay awake so you can sleep." Dominic's hand tightened on the edge of the car door. Not because the sentence was sad, because he had heard it before. He had said it. 1977. A parking lot behind a Kmart in Bridgeport, Connecticut. His mother in the driver's seat, him in the back. The same words, the same night that never ended. Nora Beckett was 32 years old. She had brown hair that hadn't been washed in 4 days, tied back with a hair elastic she'd found on the floor of the car. Her hands were chapped from washing them with gas station soap in cold water. She'd lost weight in the last 12 days, enough that her collarbone pressed sharp against the collar of her jacket. She had not eaten a full meal in 6 days, because the $14 in her pocket had to feed 2 children, and children eat first. That was not a decision. That was gravity. 12 days ago, Nora had come home from a grocery run to find the locks changed. A sheriff's deputy was standing on her own porch, holding a court order. Trent was beside him, arms crossed, wearing the expression of a man who had rehearsed concern in a mirror. The order said she was a danger to the household. It cited erratic behavior, substance abuse concerns, failure to maintain a safe environment for the children. Every word a lie. Every lie notarized. She had screamed. She had shown the deputy her ID with the house address printed on it. She had pointed at the garden she'd planted in the backyard, the car seat in the driveway, the mail with her name on it. The deputy had looked at her with a face full of procedure and said, "Ma'am, I understand, but this is a court order. You'll need to take it up with a judge." Trent had let her take the girls. A calculated mercy. He didn't want the children. He wanted the house, the leverage, the narrative. He wanted her living in a car, so that when CPS came knocking, they'd find a mother in a parking lot and a father in a clean home with a stocked fridge. The architecture of his abuse had never been physical. It was procedural. He had spent 2 years laying the groundwork, opening accounts in her name, fabricating therapy records, telling neighbors she had episodes, building a case the way an arsonist builds a fire, slowly, carefully, making sure the accelerant was in place before striking the match. In the back seat, Cora had organized their world into a system. Shoes in one corner, the emergency duffel under the seat, 2 granola bars wrapped in a napkin placed on top, labeled in her mind as tomorrow. An 8-year-old running logistics for her family's survival. Nora looked through the windshield. The Range Rover hadn't moved. The man was still standing beside it, a silhouette against the fluorescent light. Her hand drifted to the ignition. Every instinct said, "Start the car. Leave." But the tank was nearly empty, and the girls had just fallen asleep. So she gripped the steering wheel with both hands and did the only thing she could. She waited. Dominic Sava didn't look like what he was. Or rather, he looked exactly like what he was, which is why most people looked away. 63 years old, broad across the shoulders, deliberate in every movement, with a face that had the quality of something carved rather than born. Gray-green eyes that gave nothing. A thin scar along his jawline from something that happened in 1989 that he had never explained to anyone, including Sullivan. He ran an organization that operated across 7 states, 300 people on payroll, legitimate businesses that laundered nothing because they didn't need to, and a reputation that functioned like gravity, invisible, constant, and dangerous to resist. But none of that was what stopped him in a gas station parking lot at 11:40 on a Tuesday night. 1977. Bridgeport, Connecticut. His mother, Miriam, had come home from her cleaning shift to find a padlock on the front door and a note taped to the glass. 4 words. "You don't live here anymore." His father, Eli Sava, had done it while she was at work. Filed papers claiming abandonment. Told the landlord Miriam had moved out. Changed the story so smoothly that by the time Miriam stood on her own porch, she was already, legally, a trespasser in her own home. She had taken Dominic to the car, a brown Oldsmobile with a cracked dashboard and a back seat that smelled like cleaning solution. They lived in that car for 3 weeks. Miriam worked her shifts, parked at different lots each night, washed Dominic's school clothes in gas station sinks, and told him every single night, "This is temporary, baby. We're going to be fine." They were not fine. Miriam never got the house back. Eli had a cousin at the courthouse and a drinking buddy who was a notary. The system absorbed her complaints like sand absorbs water. She filed. She waited. She was told to file again. She died 4 years later in a women's shelter from pneumonia, that her body was too exhausted to fight. Dominic was 16. He did not cry at the funeral. He stood at the graveside in a borrowed suit and made a decision that would define the next 47 years of his life. He would become the kind of man that systems could not ignore. Now he stood in a parking lot watching condensation fog the windows of a sedan, watching a handprint on the glass that was already fading, and the memory of his mother's car, the cracked dashboard, the smell of cleaning solution, the lie that they were fine, rose in him with a force that no amount of discipline could hold down. He walked toward the car, not fast, not slow, with the measured pace of a man who had made a decision that nothing would reverse. Nora saw him coming Her hand tightened on the ignition key. In the back seat, Cora sat up instantly, eyes open, scanning the dark, wearing the look of a child who had learned to sleep the way soldiers do, ready to wake at the sound of footsteps. He stopped 6 feet from the driver's side door, hands at his sides, visible, open. He didn't lean down. He didn't tap the glass. He stood at a distance that said, "I am choosing not to come closer," and he spoke through the window in a voice so low it barely carried above the hum of the fluorescent lights. "I'm not going to bother you. I'm not walking closer unless you tell me to." And Nora's hand stayed on the key. Her eyes did what they always did now. The quick scan, the threat calculation, the reading of a man's posture the way other people read words on a page. His size, his stillness, the way he held his hands like someone who had practiced being non-threatening, which meant he knew what threatening looked like. "We're fine." The lie. The automatic inherited survival lie. The one that passes from mother to mother like a bloodline no one asked for. And Dominic heard it the way a musician hears a wrong note. Instantly. Completely. Because it was his mother's voice coming out of a stranger's mouth. The same 2 words, the same careful tone, the same prayer disguised as a statement. He didn't challenge it. Instead, he said something she didn't expect. "Your older girl. She's got her hand on the little one's chest. She's counting her sister's breathing." Nora blinked. She turned. And there it was. Cora's hand resting on Ellie's rib cage, rising and falling with each breath, fingers slightly spread, monitoring. The way a nurse would. The way a child does when she has carried too much responsibility for too long and doesn't know how to set it down, even in her sleep. Nora turned back. Her eyes were wet, but her voice was steady. "What do you want?" "There's a diner a mile from here. I'd like to buy your girls a hot meal." "We don't need." "I know you don't need it. I'm asking if you'll accept it." The distinction landed. The difference between someone deciding what you need and someone asking what you'll allow. It was a language Nora hadn't heard in years. From the back seat, Cora's voice, quiet, direct, already awake, already watching. "Are you a bad person?" Dominic looked at the 8-year-old. He didn't smile. He didn't soften his face into something false. He paused, and then he answered the way only an honest man, or a dangerous one, would. "Some people think so." Then, quieter. "But not tonight." Silence. Nora looked at her daughters, at the granola bars on the seat, at the fuel gauge sitting below, empty. She looked at the man standing 6 feet from her window, with his hands open, and his voice low, and something in his eyes that she couldn't name but recognized, because she had seen it once before, in her own mirror, the morning after she stopped pretending everything was fine. She turned the key. The engine coughed, then caught. "I'll follow you. I'm not riding with you." Dominic nodded once and walked back toward the Range Rover without another word. Nora looked at the fuel gauge, where the needle sat a hair below the red line. She had maybe 2 miles in the tank. This diner better be close. The diner sat on the corner of a street that had no reason to be busy at midnight, but was anyway. Small, brick, with a bell above the door and windows fogged from the inside. The kind of place where the coffee was too strong, and the waitress didn't ask questions she didn't need answers to. Dominic walked in ahead of them, not beside them, not behind, ahead. Creating distance, making it clear that the woman and her children were choosing to follow, not being led. Booth in the back, red vinyl seats, a window that looked out onto nothing. Nora sat with the girls on one side. Dominic sat across. The waitress brought menus. Ellie held hers with both hands and stared at it like a treasure map, her eyes moving across the pictures of waffles and eggs and bacon with the kind of focus that should have been joy, but looked closer to disbelief. Cora scanned the menu and pointed to the cheapest item. A side of toast. A habit. A reflex learned in 12 days of watching her mother count coins. Dominic spoke to the waitress without looking at the menu. Whatever they want, keep it open. While they waited, he asked nothing. He pressed nothing. He sat with his hands on the table and let the silence do what silence does when it's given without expectation. It gives people room to breathe. Nora spoke first. He didn't hit me. Not once. He didn't have to. He dismantled my entire life with paperwork. It came out in fragments. The forged therapy records. The fabricated court filings. The joint account drained 2 weeks before the locks were changed. The neighbors he'd quietly told she was having a breakdown, so that when she showed up on her own porch, screaming at a sheriff's deputy, every person on the street nodded and looked away. And CPS. He'd called CPS. They were investigating her. Not him. Her. The food arrived. Ellie ate her pancakes with both hands. Fast. Desperate. Then stopped. She tore the last half of a pancake free, wrapped it carefully in a napkin, and placed it on the seat beside her. For later. Nora saw it and turned toward the window. Dominic saw both and his jaw tightened until the muscle in his cheek flickered. Cora drew on the paper placemat with a crayon the waitress had left. 3 stick figures. A car. No house. Nora looked at Dominic. Her voice was steady, but her hands were not. Where he told CPS, "I'm living in my car with the children. And the worst part is, he's right. That's exactly what I'm doing. And when they find us, they'll take my girls and hand them to the man who put us here." She looked at Cora's drawing. The 3 figures standing beside a car with no door and no destination. The trap is perfect. He built it so I'd walk right into it. And I did. Dominic stepped outside alone. The night air hit his face like cold water. Sullivan was leaning against the Range Rover, arms crossed, watching the diner door the way he watched every door Dominic walked through. Ready. Dominic didn't speak. He stood on the sidewalk with his hands in his coat pockets and stared at nothing. And Sullivan knew not to interrupt. There were silences that meant Dominic was thinking, and silences that meant something older was moving through him. This was the second kind. The memory came without permission. 1979. A courthouse hallway in Bridgeport. His mother standing in line at a clerk's window, holding a folder of documents she'd photocopied at the public library. Forms she'd filled out by hand, carefully, because Miriam did everything carefully, even when her hands were shaking. She was trying to prove she lived in her own home, that she had not abandoned her family, that the papers her husband had filed were lies. The clerk told her she'd filled out the wrong form. Miriam went back to the library. She came back the next week with the correct form. The clerk told her the filing window had closed. She came back a 3rd time. And this time the clerk looked at her with the particular expression of a person who has decided that someone else's suffering is not their department, and said the case had already been processed. The system hadn't worked against Miriam. It had simply not worked for her, which was the same thing in the end. The passive, grinding, bureaucratic indifference that kills people as quietly and as surely as any fist. He remembered the shelter, the metal cot. His mother's hands, cracked from cleaning solution, shaking from exhaustion. He remembered the night she coughed so hard, the woman on the next cot got up and moved to the far side of the room. He remembered the morning he had to shake her shoulder 3 times before her eyes opened, and the look on her face when they did. Not pain, not fear. Apology. When she was apologizing for being too tired to be his mother. She died 6 months later, and something in Dominic had closed like a door slamming at the end of a long hallway. He had not opened it in 47 years. It was open now. He pulled out his phone. 2 calls. Sullivan, I need the Westin, 2-bedroom suite, indefinite, under a name I'll give you. The second call was shorter. He dialed a number he had not used in 2 years. A woman answered on the 3rd ring with the voice of someone who does not appreciate being woken, but is accustomed to it. Renata. Wake up. I need you on something by morning. He hung up. He put the phone away. He walked back into the diner. Nora was helping Ellie zip her jacket. Cora was already watching the door. She had seen him come back before Nora did. The soldier's eyes. Always scanning. Always first. Dominic sat down across from them. He looked at Nora, and he said 5 words. I know what he did. Not I know what happened to you. Not I'm sorry. I know what he did. The distinction mattered. It assigned blame. It named the perpetrator. And for Nora, who had spent 12 days being treated as the problem, who had spent months being made to feel like the cause of her own destruction, hearing someone place the weight where it belonged cracked something open inside her chest that she had been holding shut with both hands. Her lips pressed together. Her eyes filled. She didn't speak. She didn't have to. The suite was on the 4th floor of the Westin. 2 beds, a kitchenette with a microwave and a mini fridge, a bathroom with clean towels folded on the counter. The sheets were white. The room smelled like soap and nothing else. It was the kind of quiet that doesn't exist in parking lots or back seats or gas station bathrooms at 2 in the morning. Dominic walked them to the door. He handed Nora the key card and said one thing. Renata will call at 8. Answer the phone. Then he turned and walked down the hallway. No lingering, no expectation, no request for gratitude. Just the sound of his shoes on the carpet and the quiet chime of the elevator arriving at the end of the hall. Nora stood in the doorway, holding the key card with both hands. Ellie pushed past her into the room, stopped in the middle of the floor, and turned in a slow circle, looking at everything as though the walls themselves were something remarkable. Then she found the bathroom. Mommy. There's a bathtub. Nora followed her in. Ellie was standing beside the tub, he running her small hand along the rim. Can I take a bath? With warm water? The specificity of it. Not can I take a bath. Can I take a bath with warm water? Because for 12 days, washing had meant gas station sinks and cold taps and paper towels that fell apart on contact. Nora turned the faucet. Steam rose. Ellie climbed in and splashed and laughed, and for the first time in 12 days, she sounded like a 5-year-old. Just a 5-year-old. Nothing more, nothing less. Nora sat on the bathroom floor with her back against the wall and watched her daughter play in warm water and pressed her hand over her mouth so Ellie wouldn't hear her cry. Cora did not explore the room. She went straight to the door. She found the deadbolt. She turned it. The latch slid into place with a heavy metal click. She tested it, pulling the handle. It held. She unlocked it, locked it again, not compulsively, confirmingly. making sure it worked, making sure it was real. Then she turned around. "Mom, do we have to leave in the morning?" "No, baby, not in the morning." Cora was quiet for a moment. Then she looked at the duffel bag sitting by the door, the bag that had stayed packed for 12 days, the bag that was always ready because they were never staying. "Can I unpack it?" The question split Nora open, because it wasn't about clothes or toothbrushes or the pair of shoes Cora had wedged into the bottom. It was about permission. Permission to believe they could stay. Permission to stop running. Permission to set something down and trust that it would still be there in the morning. "Yes," Nora whispered, "you can unpack it." That night, for the first time in 12 days, Nora slept lying down, a flat on her back in a real bed with real sheets and a pillow beneath her head, instead of a balled-up jacket against a car window. Cora and Ellie slept in the second bed. Ellie curled into Cora's side, Cora's arm draped across her sister the way it always was. At 2 in the morning, Nora woke. The room was dark. The bed beside her was half empty. She sat up and found Cora standing at the window, looking down at the parking lot 4 stories below. "What are you doing?" Cora didn't turn around. Her voice was flat, calm, the voice of a child who had stopped being a child somewhere in the last 12 days and hadn't found her way back yet. Making sure he didn't find us. She meant Trent. At 8 years old, Cora Beckett was still running perimeter checks. Renata Voss called at 8:02 the next morning. Her voice had the quality of a scalpel, a no wasted motion, no unnecessary warmth, but precise kindness in the places where kindness mattered. "Tell me everything." Nora did. She sat on the edge of the hotel bed with the phone pressed to her ear and told Renata what she had told Dominic, and then she told her the rest. The parts she hadn't said out loud yet. The fabricated therapy records Trent had created using a counselor she'd never visited. The joint account he'd drained 2 weeks before the locks were changed, leaving her with nothing but the cash she'd hidden in a kitchen drawer. The neighbors he'd spent months conditioning, casual comments at the mailbox, concerned looks at block parties, a carefully constructed portrait of a wife who was falling apart. So that when Nora stood on her own porch, screaming at a deputy, every person on the street already had the story Trent had written for them. Renata listened to every word. Then she did something no one else had done. She took Trent's strategy apart, piece by piece, and named it. This is coercive control through institutional manipulation. It's more common than anyone admits. It's harder to prove than physical abuse because there are no bruises, no hospital records, no photographs. But it is not impossible. She laid out the plan. File an emergency motion to vacate the fraudulent court order. Subpoena the bank records. Depose the neighbors. Pull the original therapy records and prove they were fabricated. Contact the school, because Cora's teachers would have noticed behavioral changes, and teachers document things. He used the system like a weapon, Renata said. We're going to use it like a shield. And then we're going to use it like a door and walk you back into your house. She addressed CPS directly. She would make contact. She would control the narrative. She would ensure that any home visit happened here, in this suite, where the girls were clean and fed and safe, not in a parking lot. Then Renata paused, the kind of pause that changes the direction of a conversation. "Nora, does your husband know anyone in the courthouse? A clerk, a friend, anyone who could have expedited that removal order?" Silence. Nora's hand tightened on the phone. His brother. His brother works for the county clerk's office. Renata's voice didn't change in volume. It changed in weight. That's not just abuse, Nora. That's fraud. And fraud has consequences that go far beyond family court. Trent Beckett was served on a Wednesday afternoon. A process server rang the doorbell, handed him the protective order, and left without a word. Trent read it standing in the doorway of the house that had been Nora's. He read every line. Then he closed the door, walked to the kitchen, set the papers on the table, and poured himself a cup of coffee. He did not throw anything. He did not raise his voice. He sat down at the table where Nora had fed their daughters every morning for 5 years, and he made a phone call. Trent Beckett was not a man who broke things when he was angry. He was a man who rebuilt the board. He understood leverage the way engineers understand load-bearing walls. Every move he had ever made was structural. He had removed Nora's income by convincing her to quit her job. I make enough for both of us. He had isolated her by manufacturing conflicts with her friends, one by one, until she had no one left to call. He had built the paper trail over 2 years, the fabricated therapy notes, the accounts opened in her name, the quiet whisper campaign with neighbors, every piece laid down like a brick in a wall that Nora didn't know was being built around her until the day the door closed. Now the protective order threatened to expose the architecture. So Trent did what men like him do. He escalated. First call. His brother at the county clerk's office. A conversation about the filing, the timeline, what could be adjusted, what couldn't. His brother's voice was nervous. Trent's was not. Second call. CPS. A new complaint. This time he added details. He told them Nora had been seen sleeping in a car with the children, that she appeared disoriented, that he feared for the girl's safety. Every word measured. See, every sentence designed to build a file. Third call. A private investigator he'd used once before for a business matter. Find her. She's somewhere in the city. She drives a gray Camry. Start with gas stations and shelters. The PI traced her to a zip code within 48 hours. Not the exact address. Not yet. But close. The radius was narrowing. Fourth call. A man from his college fraternity, who now practiced family law. I need full custody filed by Friday, and I need the girls removed from her care by the end of the month. He hung up. He set the phone on the table beside the protective order. He sat in the kitchen in the chair where Nora used to sit, at the table where Cora used to draw, in the house where Ellie used to run down the hallway in bare feet, laughing at nothing. And he smiled, because in his mind, the architecture was intact. The system was still his. The outcome was still inevitable. He didn't know about Dominic Sava. He was about to. Sullivan's report came on a Thursday morning. A private investigator had been asking questions in the hotel's zip code, showing a photograph, describing a gray Camry, asking about a woman with 2 young girls. Dominic received the information without expression. He was sitting in the back office of a restaurant he owned on the east side of the city. He set his coffee down. He made 3 calls. The first was to the Westin. Within the hour, Nora's suite was relisted under a company name that traced back to a holding group, that traced back to another holding group, that traced back to nothing. A dead end, wrapped inside a dead end. In the kind of paperwork that existed specifically so that people like Trent Beckett could search forever and find exactly 0. The second call was to a man who knew the PI professionally, not a friend, something more useful than a friend, an associate. The PI received a visit that afternoon, not a threat, a conversation, a professional suggestion that this particular case carried complications that were not worth the risk to his license. The PI reviewed the suggestion. He dropped the client within 24 hours and refunded the retainer without explanation. The third call was the one that mattered. Dominic contacted someone in the county clerk's office, not Trent's brother, the brother's supervisor. A quiet audit was initiated on the paperwork that had produced Nora's removal order, and irregularities began to surface the way cracks appear in a wall when someone looks closely enough. Signatures that didn't match, filing dates that preceded the supposed incidents by weeks, a notarization that had been backdated. Dominic didn't confront Trent. He didn't need to. He dismantled the scaffolding Trent had built, piece by piece, from the foundation up. The same way Trent had used paperwork to destroy Nora's life, Dominic used scrutiny to destroy the paperwork. The weapon turned on the wielder. Meanwhile, the suite at the Westin began to feel less like a hiding place and more like a home. The girls ate meals at a table. Cora started reading books from a box a volunteer had dropped off, sitting cross-legged on the bed, turning pages with a focus that looked almost like peace. Ellie drew. Every drawing was a house. Every house had a door. Every door had a lock. Renata called on a Friday afternoon. The emergency motion has been granted. A judge reviewed the original removal order and flagged it for an evidentiary hearing. Your husband will have to prove in court that those documents are legitimate. Nora closed her eyes. And Nora. His brother has been suspended from the clerk's office pending an internal investigation. The net was closing. The architecture Trent had spent 2 years building was being opened to the light, and light was the one thing it could not survive. But the hearing was in 5 days, and Trent Beckett was not the kind of man who waited for the system to finish him. He acted first. The hearing lasted 40 minutes. Renata presented the evidence the way a surgeon presents a blade: fraudulent filings, backdated notarizations, bank records showing the joint account drained 2 weeks before the removal order was executed, testimony from Cora's school counselor documenting anxiety, withdrawal, and a child who had stopped drawing houses, the CPS caseworker's independent assessment, which cleared Nora entirely, and noted that the children showed no signs of neglect, only signs of a mother doing everything she could with nothing. Trent's attorney attempted to counter, but the documentation was a wall, and walls don't move because someone argues with them. The judge vacated the original order, full custody to Nora. Trent barred from the property, a criminal referral made to the district attorney's office for filing fraud. His brother's suspension from the clerk's office was entered into the record. Trent sat in the courtroom in a suit that cost more than Nora's car. And for the first time, his face showed something he could not control. Not anger, exposure. The look of a man whose architecture had been opened to the light, and who had just discovered that light was the one thing it was never built to withstand. Nora drove the girls home that afternoon. Their home. She pulled into the driveway and turned off the engine and sat there. The garden she'd planted was overgrown. The mailbox was full. The front door still had the lock Trent had installed the day he erased her from her own life. A locksmith was waiting on the porch, arranged by Renata. He changed the lock in 8 minutes and handed Nora 2 keys. She looked at them for a moment. Then she gave one to Cora. Cora stood at the front door with the key in her hand. She looked at Nora. She looked at the lock. Then she slid the key in, turned it, and pushed the door open. She stood in the doorway of her own home and breathed. Ellie ran past her, down the hallway, into her bedroom. The scream that followed was not fear. It was the opposite of fear. My bed is still here. She threw herself onto it face first and laughed. The kind of full-body, uncontained, breathless laughter that only exists in children who have been returned to something they believed was gone forever. Nora walked into the kitchen. Her kitchen. The table was still there, the chairs, the window above the sink that looked out onto the backyard where the garden waited, overgrown but alive. She put her hands on the counter and stood there, just breathing, just being in a room that was hers. Cora closed the front door. She turned the deadbolt. It slid into place with a sound that filled the hallway like a heartbeat. She tested it. It held. She turned around, and she smiled. Not the cautious, careful smile she had worn for 12 days. A real one. The kind that starts at the mouth and doesn't stop until it reaches the place inside the chest where trust lives, or where trust begins to rebuild. That evening, a dark car passed slowly down the street. Dominic Sava sat in the passenger seat. Sullivan drove. Dominic looked at the house, at the light in the kitchen window, at the shapes moving behind the curtain, at the overgrown garden that someone would tend again soon. He didn't stop. He didn't call. He didn't need anything from this. Sullivan glanced at him. Good outcome. Dominic was quiet for a moment, then softly, in a voice Sullivan had never heard him use before. She would have liked this. Sullivan knew he meant Miriam. The car turned the corner. The kitchen light stayed on. Inside, Ellie was showing Cora something. A drawing, a toy, something small and important. Nora was at the stove. The deadbolt held. Not because the world had changed, but because in one small corner of it, someone didn't look away.